at the inheritance meeting, right as my brother Mason puffed out his chest and declared, "Mom and Dad are giving all 8 rental houses in Florida to me, Tegan. You get nothing." The whole room erupted in cheers. People clapped. Someone laughed too loudly. And Mason grinned like he'd just been crowned king. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I simply smiled, leaned forward, and said quietly, "Dad, you really don't know, do you?" He froze. His face drained of color. Mason slammed his hand on the table. "No, what?" The celebration around the table had an energy I'd known my entire life, one that favored noise over substance. Mason basked in the attention, absorbing every compliment like he had personally built those rental homes, brick by brick. He held up the remote and clicked proudly through a slideshow 8 houses, each one framed on the screen as if he were unveiling a collection he had earned. In reality, he had never visited most of them, but that was Mason's specialty, claiming ownership of things he didn't truly understand. My parents sat at the center of the table, smiling in that performative way that suggested they believed this meeting proved how strong and united the Rowley family was. It was supposed to be a formal inheritance discussion, but the atmosphere was less estate planning and more victory parade. Mason had been handed the spotlight before I even arrived. Growing up, I learned early that my worth in this family was measured quietly, while Mason's was shouted from rooftops. He was the heir, the golden child, the boy destined to carry the Rowley name. I, on the other hand, was expected to stay out of the way, to celebrate his wins, and to never ask for more than polite acknowledgement. When Mason barely passed a class, he was praised for working hard. When I earned top marks, I received a quick nod and a reminder not to brag. So when Mason announced, "Tegan gets nothing," no one reacted with surprise. A few relatives even smirked in my direction, as if waiting to see me crumble. But they didn't realize something important. Years of being underestimated doesn't break a person, it sharpens them. And I had been sharpening in silence for a long time. I watched my father carefully. His expression, forced into a confident smile, didn't match the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't celebrating. He was masking something subtle, something worried. It was in the way his jaw tightened, the way he avoided meeting my eyes, the way he reached for his water glass with fingers that trembled slightly. He knew something wasn't right. He knew he'd made a mistake. He just didn't know which one. Yet, because what no one at the table realized, not my brother, not my parents, not the relatives cheering loudly, was that I had signed something with my father months earlier, something he never thought I'd read carefully, something he assumed meant nothing, something he didn't remember placed a legal safeguard exactly where he never expected it. I didn't come to the meeting empty-handed. I came prepared. So when I told him, "Dad, you really don't know, do you?" It wasn't a threat. It was the truth finally stepping out of the shadows, and the look on his face said he knew it. Thank you for listening to this opening chapter. If the story is speaking to you so far, a like or subscribe truly gives me the motivation to keep sharing it. And if you have any thoughts or reactions, I always appreciate seeing your comments. Growing up a Rowley meant learning to read the room before you read the people in it. In our family, appearances mattered more than truth, and the volume of praise Mason received was always louder than the quiet effort behind it. I used to wonder whether my parents even noticed the imbalance, or if they simply believed favoritism was part of good parenting. Over time, I stopped wondering. I just accepted the reality Mason was the center of gravity, and the rest of us orbited around him. When we were kids, Dad took Mason on business trips, teaching him about the economy, real estate, responsibilities, things Mason barely paid attention to but pretended to understand. I stayed home with Mom, who usually handed me a list of chores to keep me productive, while Mason tagged along to Florida to see the newest rental house. I was learning how to paint fences, fold laundry perfectly, and smile politely when relatives praised him for things he didn't do. I never complained. Not once. Because I understood something even my parents didn't. Listening teaches you more than talking. Observing gives you information bragging never will. And silence, when used wisely, becomes power. By the time I reached my 20s, I had built a life outside of our family's scripted roles. I earned certifications, took classes my parents didn't know existed, and found a career path that didn't depend on the Rowley name. Meanwhile, Mason continued working with Dad. Though working is a generous word for it. Most days he shadowed, nodded, and repeated phrases he barely understood. Dad called it mentorship. Everyone else called it nepotism. Still, I knew one thing: I was invisible in their grand plan. And, honestly, I didn't mind until the day I stumbled onto paperwork my father had forgotten he asked me to notarize. It was a binder labeled Property Trust Revision. He handed it to me casually, expecting me to stamp it blindly. But I read it. Every page, every clause, every condition, and that was when I saw it, the detail my father had overlooked. The detail Mason couldn't comprehend even if someone read it aloud to him. The detail that would change everything at the inheritance meeting. Back at the table, in the middle of Mason's dramatic slideshow. That detail echoed in my mind like a quiet, steady heartbeat. He flashed another picture on the screen, house #6. The yellow duplex with the palm trees, and bragged, "This one will make the most money once I renovate it." He had never seen it, never stepped foot near it. He didn't even know which county it was in, but that was Mason, confident in things he didn't understand. My father finally cleared his throat, ready to officially declare Mason the sole heir to the Florida houses. The room quieted. Everyone leaned in. That was when I caught my father's eye. Just a moment. Enough to let him know something was coming, something he should have prepared for. He swallowed hard, because he remembered, suddenly, and far too late, that the trust binder he had given me to notarize wasn't the final version. It was the temporary version. The version he forgot to revise before signing. The one that, by his own oversight, listed both of his children as beneficiaries. Equally. And in front of that entire room, I wasn't going to pretend I didn't know. The room didn't know it yet. But the moment my father swallowed hard, really swallowed, like the air had suddenly turned too thick to breathe, the balance of that inheritance meeting shifted. People sensed something, even if they couldn't name it. A low hum swept across the table. Conversations softened. Forks paused mid-air. It was the kind of tension that happens when a secret walks into the room before anyone announces it. Mason, of course, didn't notice. He was too busy bragging about projected rental income and future renovations, topics he only pretended to understand. He clicked to the next slide. A blurry exterior shot of house #3. And said, "Dad said this one's basically mine already." He didn't see Dad flinch. He didn't see Mom gripping her napkin like she was holding on to the last thread of control. But I saw everything. Dad cleared his throat again. Louder this time. Trying to regain authority. "Let's move forward," he said. Voice tight. "We need to finalize the distribution of assets." I leaned back in my chair and spoke quietly, but clearly enough to cut through the chatter. "Are you sure you want to finalize it?" That did it. Silence. Instant. Heavy. Confused. Aunt Denise blinked and whispered. "What does that mean?" Uncle Mark muttered. "Here we go." Mason slammed the laser pointer onto the table and snapped. "Stop talking in riddles. What are you trying to say?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I opened my bag and pulled out a folder, the one I'd kept untouched for months. Waiting for this exact moment, I placed it on the table gently, almost respectfully, because the weight of certainty doesn't need theatrics. Dad stared at the folder like it was a ghost from his past. Because, in a way, it was Tegan, Mom said carefully. "What is that?" "The truth." I answered. Mason barked a laugh. "Oh, please. What truth? You're trying to ruin this because you're jealous. You're not Dad's business partner. You're not even involved in the Florida properties," I sighed. "That's the problem. Mason, you don't know what you don't know." He shoved his chair back so hard it screeched across the floor. "Tell us. Right now." So I opened the folder. Inside were copies of the trust documents pages my father had given me to notarize. Pages he assumed I'd stamp and forget. But he underestimated me. He always had. I turned the document toward the center of the table, letting every relative see the header, Rowley Property Trust. Preliminary signed version. Dad's jaw locked. His eyes dropped to the line he feared most. The line he had forgotten existed. The one with two names. Beneficiary A, Mason Rowley. Beneficiary B, Tegan Rowley. Not conditional. Not symbolic. Not temporary. Equal. A ripple went through the room. Shock. Disbelief. Whispers stacking on top of whispers. "That's not right." Mason growled. "Dad would never sign that." Dad opened his mouth. But no sound came out. I gently tapped the signature line. His signature. Dated. Stamped. Filed. Legally binding. "This is the version you signed, Dad," I said softly. "Before you made changes. Before you thought to remove me. Before you assumed no one would ever notice." He looked at me with something raw fear mixed with regret. Because he knew. He remembered. And worst of all, he understood that the mistake was his, not mine. For a stretched moment, no one at the table spoke. You could hear the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint clink of someone setting down their fork. But nothing else. The truth had entered the room like a slow-moving storm, and everyone was waiting to see where it would land. My father stared at the document, as if the lines on the page might rearrange themselves into something more convenient. My mother blinked rapidly, trying to mask the panic that showed in the tightening corners of her eyes. And Mason, standing stiffly beside his overturned chair, looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from beneath him. Finally, he managed. "That's not real. This can't be real." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply kept my tone calm and steady. "It's real. Mason. You know it is. Dad gave me the binder himself. He signed this version. He just forgot that preliminary documents become binding once they're notarized and filed. He thought he had more time to revise it." My father closed his eyes. The truth landing on him with the weight of a decision he underestimated. He whispered, barely loud enough for the table to hear, "I didn't think you would read it that closely." The room shifted. Even relatives who usually ignored me looked stunned. Aunt Denise let out a small gasp. Uncle Mark muttered something under his breath like, "Oh boy. Henry, what did you do?" Mason pointed at me with shaking hands. "You tricked him. You planned this. You always wanted to ruin what's mine." I met his glare without flinching. "What's yours?" "Mason. Or what you assumed would be yours. Think carefully before you answer." Dad sat down heavily. rubbing his temples. I could tell he was replaying the moment he had handed me the binder. He had assumed I would follow directions, stamp the pages, and hand it back without a second thought. He never imagined I would read every line. He never considered that the quiet child he overlooked had grown into a woman who paid attention. Relatives began whispering. Some tilted toward each other, trying to understand how the situation had flipped so quickly. A few even avoided making eye contact, clearly uncomfortable that the usual family hierarchy had been disrupted. Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling between frustration and fear. "Tegan, honey, this must be a misunderstanding. You know your father never meant for things to be complicated." I looked at her softly. Complicated. Mom. Or equal. The word equal hung in the air like something foreign. Our family had never operated on equality. Mason was first. Always. I was second. Sometimes third, depending on who else was in the room. Dad finally lifted his head. "Tegan, why didn't you tell us you saw the documents months ago? Because you never asked." I said, "And because you made it clear my place in this family was to stay quiet." So I stayed quiet. Until now. The truth settled across the table like dust, finally stopping mid-air. Mason let out a frustrated growl and sank into his chair. Dad looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Even Mom's posture shifted, shoulders sinking as if the weight of years finally pressed against her. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt seen. For the first time in my life. And they felt it too. The meeting didn't end so much as it unraveled. One by one. Relatives found excuses to leave the table. A few slipped out quietly, avoiding my gaze because they weren't sure whether to congratulate me or pretend nothing had happened. Others lingered awkwardly, whispering among themselves with expressions that mixed confusion, guilt, and something close to realization. Years of favoritism had just been challenged in the most undeniable way possible. And no one knew how to behave. Mason sat rigidly, staring at the trust documents as if they might burst into flames and rewrite themselves. His jaw clenched and unclenched, his fingers tapping the table with quick, frustrated movements. For the first time, he seemed to understand that anger could not fix this. Dad could not fix this. The world he believed belonged to him simply because he existed was shifting beneath his feet. Mom finally broke the silence. "Tegan, please. Can we talk about this privately?" She looked exhausted, like the weight of years had suddenly landed on her shoulders. I nodded calmly. "We are talking. Everything that needed to be said is already here." Dad leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "I should have reviewed the paperwork more carefully. I should have." He let the sentence fade, not because he didn't have more to say, but because he understood the truth was simple and unchangeable. Mason pushed himself to his feet. "This isn't over. I'll fight this. I'll get my lawyer. I'll make sure no judge lets you take what belongs to me." I stood too. Not out of confrontation, but clarity. "Mason, the houses belong to both of us. Not just you. Not because I demanded it, but because Dad signed it that way. I didn't steal anything. I didn't manipulate anything. You assumed I would always stay invisible. That was your mistake. Not mine." Mom reached for him, but he pulled away and stormed out of the dining room, leaving a trail of frustrated footsteps down the hallway. The front door slammed a moment later. The sound echoed through the house with a finality none of them expected. The room fell quiet again. Dad looked at me. Not angrily. Not with disappointment. But with something like acceptance. "You were always paying attention," he said. I just never gave you credit for it. I nodded. I know. For the first time, there was no bitterness in my voice. No resentment. Just truth. I wasn't fighting for validation anymore. The inheritance wasn't about money or property. It was about being acknowledged, seen, counted. Mom let out a long, tired breath. I don't know how we got here. I do, I said gently. We got here by pretending fairness didn't matter. She looked down at the table. And for once, she didn't argue. As I gathered my things and walked toward the door, the house felt different than it ever had. Not hostile. Not cold. Just honest. The imbalance that had shaped my entire childhood had finally been pulled into the light. And even if it made some people uncomfortable, it also made something else possible. A clean start. Finding peace has never been loud. Sometimes it is simply choosing to leave a room that never made space for you. Standing tall with the truth beside you. Before I end this story, thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you enjoyed the story, a like or subscribe truly helps me keep sharing more. And if you have any thoughts or feelings you'd like to share, I always appreciate reading your comments.